Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week, we dive into the stories, technology, and ideas shaping a profitable and sustainable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Michael Boland from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Boland is a professor of agricultural economics at the University of Minnesota who specializes in cooperative structures and governance. He has experience with working with cooperatives in many different types throughout all of agriculture and in many different countries as well. So I thought he was a great person to pull in for this topic of governance and structure of cooperatives. And it's something that I'm passionate about. I've been involved in several different leadership roles in cooperatives that I work with and am a part of and a member of. And I saw Dr. Boland at a National Milk Producers Federation event back about a year and a half ago speaking on this topic. And I thought he would be a great person to have this conversation with today. So please listen up and enjoy this conversation with Dr. Michael Boland. Well, Dr. Boland, thank you so much for being on the AgCulture Podcast today. I'm looking forward to our conversation and discussion about cooperative governance, everyone's favorite topic, right?
That's right.
Well, before we get into that, could you give us a brief background on yourself, what you do at University of Minnesota, as well as what kind of got you interested and focused on really helping cooperatives in agriculture?
So, well, first I'll say congratulations on your Nuffield scholarship. I do a lot of work with Irish cooperatives, and I've met a number of directors who have gotten the scholarship over there and seen written copies of things they've done and done, I've done similar programs like we're doing today with them. So congratulations. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity for you. So I grew up, I'm the oldest 12 children. We had 80 acres in southern Minnesota. My cousin had a dairy farm, you think about 80 acres, 12 kids and 60 cows. There's no amount of math that's going to make that farm profitable, especially when you have a stanchion barn and old technology. But it worked. He came back from World War II, and the government had programs to get people who were veterans into farmland. And the farm, he drained some bogs and things. Today, we wouldn't let farmers do that, but that was the 80 acres he had. His brother got a farm nearby. And so, and that's what he's, in those days, a farmer would start milking cows, and the technology they started with, in this case, a stanchion barn is the technology they use for their whole life. It's not like today where people can trade up periodically. You took the wealth you had, you put it into what you had, and then you use that until you retired. And so, his big investment in 1957 was he bought a thrashing machine, and then in 1958, the combine harvester came out and he parked the thresher in the shed and never moved from that machine shed until he died, and they auctioned it off. So, we belonged to every co-op management. Our bank was a credit union. We were members of 4 farm supply cooperatives that we did business with. Today, there's only one through mergers and bankruptcies and so forth. But our insurance was through a township mutual. In those days, they were called township mutuals. Today, they're just farm mutual associations. Auto insurance was done with State Farm, which is a mutual insurance company. Our milk went to Land O'Lakes. I mean, you look around and all the things it was part of just everything we did. And the co-ops offered us credit, which today we're so accustomed to having easy credit and credit cards and things, and we just didn't have in those days. So having the ability to have credit from your cooperative and pay it back in 30 days, was just a blessing for us. So I think a part of it was just the DNA of where I was born, the family I was born in. And then, I worked for a farm supply cooperative for 4 years. So I got to see, how the CEO did things and work in agronomy and feed and energy and the things that we typically think about with a farm supply cooperative. And then I thought maybe I'd be a co-op manager someday or something. And then I was taking classes for my graduate degree, and somebody said, you might be really good at working at a university, but you're gonna have to go somewhere to get your PhD, and you're gonna have to go somewhere where you're more than 12 hours from home, because you can't go home on the weekends and milk cows and bale hay and play softball with your brothers and sisters. And it was great advice, just wonderful advice. I went to Purdue and then had job offers in Australia and Canada and Kansas State. And went to Kansas State. We had an Arthur Capper Cooperative Center there that I did some work in. And so I started working a lot with director education, and because we have a lot of co-ops in Colorado and Kansas. So, if you go back 50 years, that at one point there were 40 people working at land-grant universities whose sole job was to work on director education. And today there's less than 6, and they're all in co-ops have tied themselves, if you will, and created centers at Missouri and Cornell and Kansas State and Oklahoma State and Texas A&M and Iowa State. And so there's just been a long link between education and land-grant universities. I've never actually had one of the positions. I've always been an agribusiness guy, but I call co-op education, if you will, directors my hobby. So I guess that's kind of as a background where my interest in co-op governance came from.
Now, why do you see it as such a critical part of a cooperative? Why is the governance side so critical?
I've got a different perspective today. So the National Association of Corporate Directors started a director certification exam 3 years ago. I studied for it, took the exam, and passed. There's only one other co-op director I know who's taken the exam, but it put a nice framework on my head. I've also been a board advisor for a couple of co-ops, AMPI in the dairy industry, Select Sires. I just rotated off the Select Sires board of directors. And I was on Unigroup, which is a logistics. So, you did a lot of board training for co-ops, and then you're actually on boards and you learn things, and then you go through a very disciplined process like I did for the NICD director exam. So you get a chance to see what good governance looks like. I've worked in more than 100 countries around the world, and, I'm 60 years old, and I've had a chance to see some really good co-ops where they have very solid, effective governance programs. And then you see a lot where there's very little attention done to it. And then, you need to work when you need to work. It's like a board is sort of like an analogy I sometimes use, like a fire department. When there's a fire, you really got to be able to work together to put the fire out. When you're a co-op board, there's going to be things that you have to deal with. And if you're not working well or practice or whatever, you're going to fail in those moments when you've got to deal with that stuff or not do as well as you'd like to. So it's really important that we have it, and the variance on governance is all over the board in terms of that. So it's a critical thing. You can't just put people on a board and assume they know how to be a good director. It doesn't work that way. So you have to make investments, and you can only get directors from what the membership looks like, right? So it's not like Fortune 500 companies that report to the Security Exchange Commission. They can source talent from all over the world, from every organization possible. In co-ops, in mutual insurance organizations, you can only use those people who are actually members and members in good standing. So it changes the dynamic of that.
What are some of the other historic dynamics that created the structures that we see today in cooperative governance?
I think so. We'll talk a bit about dairy. We go back 100 years when the creameries were first put together. We had all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of creameries all over the place, and they went through waves of consolidation in the 1920s and 40s and late 1960s and so forth. But every county had a princess competition. Every county had a state fair, a county fair with a big bunch of Holstein and Jerseys and Brown Swiss, and once in a while some other exotic dairy species might show up at the county fair. But and all these dairy farmers, like my cousins and the farm I worked with, were all the same. And so, but over time, we've seen a hollowing out of the dairy industry, and so We're very reluctant to merge counties, for example. Doge right now in Washington is trying to do things to make us more efficient by merging USDA offices and things, which, there's a lot of value and savings in some of those things. As the dairy industry has gotten hollowed out, as we've seen that the wave of retirements and of people like the farms I grew up with and that I sometimes have nostalgia for, the new farmers have got 2,000 cows. It's a much different type of business, and they may or may not choose to involve themselves in co-op governance. And so we're seeing a hollowing out. The dairy farm numbers keep going down critically. The number of cows is stayed the same or gone up. Productivity has gone up. It's a great story, actually. It just means we have numbers of people, but our institutions haven't downsized. So our DHIA association is still there. We haven't seen as many mergers, and all those things require boards. Our dairy commodity checkoff programs, we haven't seen a lot of mergers there. Every county seems to want to have their own board. And so you start looking at the organizations, the number of farmers has downsized. The number of people involved in all of these wonderful governance structures don't exist, and our governance structures haven't merged fast enough to account for the new reality of the hollowing out of what's happened, especially in the Midwest where I'm from here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Northern Iowa. It has happened so fast, the governance structures haven't kept up with what's happened in the dairy industry, for example, and increasing what's happening in the farm supply industry as well.
I know in my cooperative, I've been in leadership roles for several years. And one of the things that I've seen, you're basically describing, is there's a lot of what we'd call districts where there's very few people that even want to be in a leadership role, let alone the capabilities of being a good leader. And then you have maybe a small area where there's 5 or 6 people that are really good, they want to be involved, and they want to be in a leadership role, they have the capabilities, but because of the structure with the districts, only one person can be out of that 5 or 6. So I've seen some of those issues come to the surface in my own time as being a cooperative member.
Public companies, for example, that report to the Securities and Exchange Commission, they don't have geographic districts, right? They just find the best directors and elect them, the investors elect them to the board. We use geography in many ways. I'm a big proponent of doing at-large district, a combination maybe of some geography at large, but really trying to account for the fact that we've got to find a better way. And look, if you're a good director, you've got the choice of what boards you can be on. You've only got so much time, right? If you're a family and you've got in the high cost part of your life with children and organized sports and you're trying to get your farm off the ground and stuff, you don't have time for these things. And not everybody's got the desire to want to be on a board of directors, nor should they be. They want to be involved in governance. So maybe they want to be in a committee that meets once a year to help plan the annual meeting, or maybe they want to be a nominating committee or something, but they're not ready for the responsibilities of a monthly board meeting or 2 days a week or 2 days a month in the case of larger co-ops, and driving, 5 or 6 hours one way to go to electric co-op board or something. And they don't want to dodge deer on the road if you're in Wisconsin or Minnesota or places. So if you want leadership opportunities and you're good at it or had enough training for it, desire for it, you've got your choice of what board you want to be on, and compensation, location, type of industry, how you feel about that board, the information you receive, how much fun it is, and so forth, worth your time. Those are all things you've got choices for, and it's not the way it was in the old days where you may, the other issue I think is we haven't talked about is incumbency. I'm not a proponent of forcing people to run against incumbents, but just like in Congress, we've got people in their 80s and 90s on running for Congress and being reelected. At some point, we have to have a transition. If you're a public company, typically that transition comes at the age of 72. So I think we have to have some way of realizing that incumbents can't just look in the mirror and say, well, nobody wants to run for my position, therefore I better run again. No, I think we have to be forceful and just create policies and procedures that are respectful. You can't have incumbents leave after 3 years, but maybe 20 years is enough, right? So we've got to find ways to deal with the incumbency issue, deal with the fact that geography is not the best way to source talent, to create some mixture of at-large districts so we can truly get the best people on the board. And then making sure we've got in an agricultural co-op, you have to be the guy, the person that drives the tractor and wears the bib overalls, to use a stereotype, to be on the board. Or if you're in a multi-generational farming family where you've got multiple family members, some who may be doing the marketing or the books, and they may never drive the tractor, or they maybe the spouse is very much involved in the farming operation. So we have to create ways to recognize that farmers today are not the picture of the Iowa farmer from 1914, American Gothic, but they're really multi-generational farming families who are legally in some type of a LLC structure or corporation or S corp or whatever it might be, with multiple family members in that, and allow them to choose the person who does the membership responsibilities for your co-op, and that may or may not be the person driving the tractor or milking the cow or whatever. So I think we have to be just very flexible to reflect the new reality of how farmers have chosen to define their business and organize themselves, which are all legal and very good to do so. And that will help us include as many people as we can when it comes to membership and get the best talent on our boards. That's a long-winded answer, but I think those are a response to some of the things you talked about on the geography side.
How involved in your mind does somebody have to be in an operation in order to be an effective delegate or board member?
So it depends on the co-op, right? So if you're a mutual insurance co-op in Minnesota, you can have insurance on, a lot of our property and casualty. So you can live in a rural area, you have an appreciation for agriculture, but you don't drive a tractor, for example. You may have farm buildings that are insured through the mutual insurance co-op. So, in a farm supply cooperative, you may, and the farm supply cooperative also has grain operations. You may not have, you may have outsourced the grain part of your operation and only deal with the co-op on the input supplies. So I think it's helpful to have some knowledge and appreciation for the multiple lines of business that your members are in. But, you could be a truck driver living in a rural area, be a member of your cooperative and buy diesel fuel from a cooperative in case of an energy co-op, but not actually have to drive the truck or drive the tractor. So I think you want a diversity of people on the board, some that are actually involved day-to-day operations of the farming, or were at one time, and some maybe they have an appreciation for it, understanding of it, but they may have different talents and so forth. Some may actually have an off-the-farm job. It's not, if you look at just the hours worked, there's lots of farmers who farm in the spring and fall, will have a full-time job. If you're in Illinois, you might work for John Deere or Caterpillar. Your farm is big enough that you could take your vacation in spring and fall, do the chores that have to be done, but work your full-time job and work 1,800 hours a year. So I think farming today is all over the place with how people call themselves a farmer and what they do.
So is that a mindset shift that has sunk into a lot of cooperatives in their governance structure, or do you think that's something that still needs to be caught up with?
Quite brutally honest, there's co-ops I know where the nominating committee says, nope, you have to drive the tractor. And I'm like, okay, you're limiting yourself as to who you can get. I mean, what's wrong with the farmer's spouse, or what's wrong, So there are co-ops that I can think of where there's lots of farmers who want to be on that board. So there's a social dimension to it. There's a desire for information. There's a desire to have a community of friends and so forth. And so that may work in those type of cooperatives. It's not going to work in other co-ops where you may struggle, the nominating committee may struggle to find suitable directors for your board, and you're dealing with retired farmers or people who may not do all their business with the co-op or whatever the case may be. And then you have conflicts and things that develop in the board. So I think you have to do is cast a wide net as you possibly can. It's great if you have a lot of people who've got lots of production agricultural experience, but realize that's not always the case in every area of every co-op.
Do you have any particular case studies or examples? I know you said you've been involved in co-ops around the world, of any really big governance steps that caused major problems that could have been avoided.
Yeah, so I don't want to name co-ops or companies or people's names. I mean,
Right.
It's fun to talk about, Tri-Valley, the cooperative that went bankrupt in 1998 in California. At the time, it was the largest co-op bankruptcy, and they had a tomato grower, an olive grower, and a peach grower on their board. I mean, it was a multi-commodity co-op, and those type things don't always work. I think from a broad standpoint, I think the way to think about this is when the costs of production are very similar among the members, co-ops tend to be in harmony with one another. So the price for the input, the price for an output like milk, or the price of crop nutrients or crop protectants or whatever, in the case of farm supply co-op, the cost of insurance. When people got similar cost reduction, they can survive on the price that the co-op quotes them. When you've got farmers who are much more cost efficient than others, think about the case of dairy, right?
Right.
Everyone's always complaining about the price of milk, but if you're the low cost dairy farmer, you might be able to survive on that price the co-op calls out, whereas a high cost producer may not be able to. So then you have conflict. I think one thing I always look for is when the cost of production underlying the membership begins to diverge, the chances of conflict are likely to creep in there. When you have an uneducated membership, when you have some people who are highly educated about co-ops and how they work and other people that don't, they just, governance is a tricky thing. We all think we understand good governance. Most people don't like to be governed. They like to raise their hand and say, go do this and go do that, but they don't understand that there's policies, right? You can't just go do something that a lot of co-ops, you've got employees who are members of the co-op. A lot of co-op directors know employees. And so when there's an employee issue, the board wants to be involved, and manager says, no, you can't be, because there's human resource policies where you can't know somebody's salary or why they're no longer with the co-op. So when you've got those issues and people don't understand their roles and responsibilities, when members are asking things of the board that they legally can't give them, when you've got cost of production to change, when when the co-op doesn't represent, if you've only got one type of farmer on the board, if you've only got high cost farmers on the board, the low cost farmers are going to say, I don't feel like I'm being represented adequately enough, and I'm going to go take my business elsewhere. So the more the core of the cooperative looks the same, the more things can be harmonious in co-op. When interests begin to diverge, it's no different than a club, right? I mean, I talked about this the first day in class. Think about a club, right? If you've got a club, say Brock and Bridle, which is a common club in the College of Agriculture and University, anybody who appreciates livestock and horses and equine, whatever, might become members. If your club is Angus, the Angus Cattle Group, you're going to have a much narrower, but you might have a more energized group of people because it's more narrow. The more broad, you may not have as much energy in the club. So where you set the boundaries of the club, where you set the boundaries of the cooperative matter in terms of how energized the membership may be. The more common the core, the more energized the member is going to be, the more educated they're going to be. But not every co-op can be that narrow because there may not be enough business to supply the co-op. And so you've got to think about the boundaries of where the co-op sets its business, their geographic boundaries, the lines of business that they're in, what they're doing for the members. All of those things matter when you think about harmony in a cooperative.
And do you think that's why some of the issues have arisen in the last 10 to 15 years as we've seen very rapid consolidation and, bigger geographies for the same co-op with less members, and those sort of things, and bigger disparities in the membership because of that?
We have a whole bunch of farmers like my cousins that were born in the 1950s and went home to farm, if you will. And they all say they retired at 75 or whenever a farmer retires these days. And then we had a bunch of farmers who didn't enter in the 1980s because of the farm crisis. They were told, don't you dare come home to farm. And now today we have young farmers. A young farmer might be 30 or 35 or 40 years old. Our farmer in Ireland, my cousin there didn't start farming full time until he was 40. His dad worked till he was 70. He worked for a pharmaceutical company and had off the farm income, which really helped the farming operation. He still milked cows once a day and stuff. But so I think we've had people just don't start farming at age 18 or 22 in the way they did and previously. And so we got lots of people that are employees for large farmers. They don't want the risk. They want the enjoyment. They want the benefit of a full-time job. Perhaps they've got benefits, but they don't want the responsibility for the equity and paying the bills and so forth. So I think what constitutes a farmer is much broader today than it ever was before. And we've got more and more multi-generational farming families who've got multiple people and multiple generations working in the business. They've gotten more complex, larger farms certainly, and then we got small farms that are, they've got a pasture system and a New Zealand style dairy, whatever you want to call it, and it seems to be working okay. I mean, organic milk prices may not be where they want to be, but so we've got more heterogeneity today in co-ops because of the heterogeneity of their members. So I think you're right on that.
So one thing I want to pivot to is the balance between member control and professional management of a co-op. How do those balance out in your mind? And I mean, it's a tight line, as you mentioned before. A lot of people that get on boards, they do it because they want to control people or manage people instead of give direction and strategic vision to where the co-op should go.
A lot of successful directors come from multi-generational farming families who've had family members on the board. So there's value in that, right? And in my co-op in Ireland, I think for the first 100 years, for 97 to 100 years, there was a Boland on the board, right? Now, there were different Bolands, but it was just, you understood through watching what it did in your family, and you had some osmosis and education coming at home. Today, it's not uncommon. You'll find someone running for the board because they want change. They want to know, they believe the co-op is off course, or they want information the co-op can't give them, or whatever it may be. And so you just got this whole dynamic of when you run for change, you're elected for change. Then once you decide the board, you find out, well, here was the reason why you were upset about that, but legally you can't talk about it, right? So it's not like you think you can run for the board, get on the board, and all of a sudden all this information will flow out the membership. It doesn't work that way. So I think that, the other thing is we aren't going to go back in history on this, but so the CEO is not on the board, but co-ops don't work very well unless they treat that CEO or general manager as a colleague, as if they were on the board. It just sort of worked out that they weren't on the board if you go back, but they could have easily been. I mean, we could have changed the statute way back 100 years ago and allowed managers to be on the board. A lot of managers come from production ag background. They've got very valuable farming experiences. And so, but the larger, more complex co-ops, it is professional CEOs. And so the board sometimes feels like they can't, that CEO is not going to be micromanaged, nor should he or she be micromanaged. And so the larger the co-op, the more knowledge the board has to be to feel like they're being treated fairly and understand what's going on things like compensation, things like job responsibilities. Do you want your co-op CEO to serve on all these boards and be in DC and be involved in all these policy things and not running the co-op and having a COO run the co-op instead? Or do you want that person to be in the office every day at their desk, supervise? So we've got co-ops that are Fortune 500 co-ops on the Fortune 500 list that are large, complex organizations. And we got tiny co-ops with, maybe 15 employees that require a different level of supervision and oversight by a board. So the bigger the co-op, the more harder it is, I think, for a director to feel confident about their responsibilities on the board. And what you don't want to have happen is that those directors view their service as a ceremonial type thing, that they that they're involved with all the nonprofit work that the co-op does, and they don't adequately provide oversight to the board. So, we've got large co-ops, say farm supply co-ops that are $2 or $3, $4 billion in sales. Those CEOs, who I know most of them, they're doing a great job educating their boards. Some of those boards and directors would be very good, valuable directors on these larger, complex boards, they may be unelectable on some of those things because people think that they're too large a farm or whatever it might be. And so we've still got issues, which is how we conduct elections. And think about, CoBank, for example, large lender to cooperatives. I mean, those type of boards, lots of people want to be on them, but sometimes the way we go about that, we discriminate against successful directors because we view them as being too successful. So I'm giving a long-winded answer. As co-ops get more complex in size, we need to make sure they got the best management possible, and the boards are best able to provide any level of oversight they possibly can and have confidence in what they're doing when they're in the boardroom.
You mentioned compensation, and you were just mentioning that about management. But what does that look like in your mind moving forward for cooperatives, especially as you said, these complex businesses moving forward? I mean, it takes up a lot more time than what it used to when it was just a local cooperative, a lot more travel, and probably a lot more education and understanding of global dynamics, global markets, monetary policy. The list is very long, right? That you really need to understand to be a valuable board member. So what's that look like in your mind for compensation for board members?
So you have to understand what is the amount of money available for the board budget. And then you got to figure out, do we want a big board or a small board? Do you want a 30-member board of directors or do you want a 7-member board of directors? A 30-member board of directors means that your compensation per director is not going to be very high, probably. The board budget is spread across 30 people. And so you may have 30 competent people, but they may not be involved or engaged, right? It's very difficult to get 30 people engaged or involved in a board. A smaller board, a board that reports to the Security and Exchange Commission, is going to be much smaller in size. They have 3 committees. The committees do a lot of work. And so you just got to ask yourself, what's the members' expectations? A big board, small board, a highly competent 7-member board of directors, or a 30-member board will recognize that you'll have a number of directors who just aren't engaged because they can't be engaged because there's too many voices to try to be heard. So I think that's where it starts from. And then I also think you just got to benchmark yourselves, bring in an outside third-party person, talk about how boards do compensation. If you're a regulated utility, for example, in the case of an electric cooperative or a farm credit type cooperative or a credit union, you're regulated. It's very common for those organizations to bring in third-party individuals to deal with compensation. We're more hesitant to do about that in other types of cooperatives because we just think they should be lean and mean, and being a director should be a volunteer. And I would say, no, that's not. You have to compensate people for their time, and you've got to figure out what's the board budget. And you got, if you got to make sure directors do something every year to upgrade their own personal knowledge as a director and upgrade their industry knowledge of the industries that they're in. So it's 2 types of education. And what programs you go to, where do you go to, all those things have to be in the board budget besides the per diem and travel compensation. In
your mind, what's the most important aspects for continuing education for a good board member?
I admire boards that have got, for example, a board might say, here's a list of meetings that we want directors to be at every year. In the case of a dairy co-op, they might say, we need directors to go to National Milk. We need directors to go to the annual meeting of CoBank, for example, our lender. We need directors at DC fly-ins to visit with our congressman, talk about dairy policy. So they may identify, let's just say, I'm pulling a number out of there. Let's just suppose they say there are 5 meetings where we want our board to be at. We recognize that our entire board can't go to all 5 meetings. They have to be home milking cows and family things. But we're going to expect that each director will go to 2 meetings or 1 meeting. And go to those meetings. And then they're also going to say, okay, so that's what they've got to do to help represent the co-op. Now they also have to improve their talent as a director. And here are 3 different meetings where we think they can improve their talent as a director. Maybe go to the director conference that the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives puts on. Maybe go on to a conference that is done by one of the national dairy organizations. Or maybe go to something totally different. Maybe go to a university program or something. So the directors are getting some level of industry knowledge, and they're being spread across the directors, and the directors got a responsibility to improve their own knowledge. Maybe it's on accounting skills and finance skills. Maybe it's on governance skills. Maybe it's on understanding the CEO board linkage. So they're doing things to improve their own talents and their information as an industry. Most directors love the industry stuff. They love to go to the meetings and hear about all things that affect them as a dairy person. They may not be as inclined to want to do the individual director development things. And that's where the really successful co-ops may bring in people and educate the whole board on a topic like accounting or things where they think the board's got a weakness. So they may do board evaluations every year, which might reveal weaknesses or areas for improvement.
People that want to get involved as a director at some point in their farming career, what advice would you have them to give on what they should be doing to prepare for that themselves? What are the key principles that they really need to understand to be a good board member?
There's value in working your way up, right? The sugar beet co-ops have to do this, right? You start on the grower association boards and gradually work your way up to the Michigan Sugar Board or the American Crystal Sugar Beets or the Southern Manor, Western Sugar, whatever it might be amalgamated. And so I think that you've got to, so showing interest, so you volunteer, right? You volunteer to be on a committee. You volunteer to be involved. You go to the annual meeting. You do things to be involved, to show interest. And then as leadership opportunities express themselves, you might decide I want to do something more, right? Maybe I want to be on an advisory board or an outside board, the co-op that might meet 1 or 2 times a year. And then maybe at some point you say, I've got the time now to go to actually run for the board. You can't miss board meetings, right? I mean, that's just not, you can't just say I'm going to run for the board and then be a couple times a year say, hey, I got to go home and milk my cows, or I've got to go home and do harvest or whatever it might be. You can't make those excuses. You've got to commit that you've got the time to do this and be involved. So I think people go through a life cycle, show interest, be involved, and do things. And then maybe at some point, if you want to do the next step to run for the board, maybe you've done some things on your own to get education. Your work with a Nuffield Scholar or whatever it might be. You've educated yourself along the way before you decide to finally, your co-op sends out a notice saying the nominating committee is now accepting nominations, and you decide I want to go through that process. The thing, the reality is nobody wants to run against an incumbent and lose, right? There's no fun in it. So your co-op has to be mindful that they have to provide opportunities for people. You don't want every director rotating off the board in the same year, right? So the board itself has to have succession plan that's logical, that allows for the infusion of new talent and the exit of experienced talent, and do in a logical way so you can plan things, right? So if nobody runs an incumbent ever wins, and your incumbent's going to retire in 6 years, it allows you to have a 6-year glide path to think about running for the board in 6 years. So those are all things that you can do to understand the dynamics of the governance system in your co-op and where you might want to get involved, have time to get involved going forward.
Good suggestions. Before we leave, what's one mindset shift that you think people in co-ops, members, need to have as they're running or voting for who's going to represent them?
That's a great comment, Paul, and it's a great ending question here for our discussion. I'm not sure there's one thing, but what I would say is that you have to look at people. We're not the same person. I work at a university. We have a lot of 75-year-old professors running around. I'm not sure that everyone ages differently. At some point, we have to retire. At some point, we have to realize that wisdom is not linear past a certain age. And so we're not the same person we were. I'm not the same person at age 60 that I was at age 40. And so the ability to track information over time becomes really critical. There's one comment I would make about boards is a number of directors just can't track information. They're told one thing at a board meeting, and then they keep asking. They lack the fact that, well, no, management talked about that 2 meetings ago or something. The information is in your board packet, and they don't go back, they don't read things ahead of time or lose track of where the information is. The other issue, I think, is that oftentimes we're impatient. A decision, we spend years on a big capital expenditure decision, for example. Contracts are let out, the construction starts, and now we want it done the next day. Management makes decisions, and those decisions have to be allowed to play themselves out. Now, we have to monitor those decisions. We got to make sure they're going in the right direction. The assumptions still hold. But we just have to allow the process to play out. So I think there's three things. And the last thing is policy, which I'll come to in a second. So I think that the ability to make sure you've got directors who can track information over time. Sometimes it's a function of age, sometimes it's a function of knowledge, sometimes it's a function of self-motivation. Number two, I think that we have to have people who are patient to understand how process works and allow the process to play out. Think about an accident or decision. The early details aren't always correct, right? People's memories are flawed and so forth. We have to wait for the information to come in. The third thing would be knowledge of policies and procedures. We deal in a regulatory society. Our type of government is not an autocracy. It's all built around policies and procedures. So we have to have people who understand that you can't just make decisions willy-nilly in a boardroom. You're bound by human resource policies. You're bound by regulatory policies of what you can and can't do. You can't pollute the environment. You can't, you got to pay people minimum wage. You got to treat people fairly, evaluate them fairly. There's all these policies and procedures, and we often don't think about that because we're maybe managing ourselves on a farm or managing one or two people. Well, now it's more complex, and oftentimes you're exempt as a farmer from certain policies that your co-op is not exempt from. Mm-hmm. So those are three things that I think I would just, as you're looking at boards or looking at yourself, am I able to be patient and understand policy and allow things to pay out? Do I understand policies and procedures? And I'm able to track information over time. And do I do my due diligence of getting prepared for a board meeting and fully participate in the board meeting?
Well, that was a great way to end the episode here, Dr. Boland. I appreciate those insights. I think those are very good things to end on here. So once again, thank you for being here and having this discussion about cooperative governance. I think it's something that's very important. I've been enjoying my career being involved in cooperative governance, and it's something I'm passionate about. So I'm glad we could have this conversation today.
Well, good luck with the rest of your Nuffield program, and congratulations again. And hopefully our paths will cross again down the road.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Boland.
Take care.
Well, once again, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. That was our conversation with Dr. Michael Boland from the University of Minnesota. And if you are involved in a cooperative, I hope you got some nuggets out of that episode. I think there's a lot of things that we really need to look at in cooperatives moving forward for the future. As Dr. Boland said, there's been such rapid consolidation in many sectors in agriculture that sometimes our organizational structures don't keep pace with that. And I think that's something that we really need to focus on in the future for many organizations in agriculture to develop for the future. Now, as always, if you found this podcast interesting, please share it with somebody you know. That's how we grow our audience here at the AgCulture Podcast. So once again, I'm Paul Windemuller, and this has been another episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Hope to see you next week.